I was driving on the back roads, on the edge of the city limits. It was dark. There was no lighting at all. A few rest stops here and there, and I was meeting a woman off Craigslist, and already feeling a wee bit nervous. I was driving pretty fast, with no other cars in sight, when out of nowhere, I see a guy running across the road. He was already almost right in front of my car. It looked like he was getting chased by another guy who I didn't see until I swerved to avoid the first one while braking hard. My car went kind of sideways and hit the second guy pretty fierce, not at full speed though, and I heard a loud thud, but didn't actually see him get hit. My car ended up on the side of the road. The first guy seems to have kept running out of sight, as he wasn't there when I got out. This was a red flag, but I had just hit someone and was worried that I had offed them. I was all shaky and had that sinking feeling in my stomach. I ran towards a guy who was on the floor breathing heavily. Thank goodness he was alive. I asked if he was okay. He didn't respond. He just kept breathing really hard. Then I took out my phone to call 911. Just as I was typing in the number, that's when I heard him say, "No, don't call anyone. Don't call the cops." He said it pretty alarmed, so I just looked over at him with my phone in hand, flash on, and I asked him if he could stand. He got up slowly with a slight limp, with my light shining on him. I could see his clothes were all tattered, and he was wearing 2 layers of clothes with a jacket, now torn at the arms. He had blood on his arms from where I guess he landed on the ground. He said, "I'm fine. Do you have any cigarettes?" Yeah, sure man. Let me go get them." I had a pack in my glove box since forever. I was an occasional smoker and only smoked with my co-worker. Not in a while. We walked over to the car. I get the cigarettes, handed them to him, and I put my phone to charge. The car was still on. As I did, he asked for a lighter, and I said, "Hold on, let me look for it." While lighting his cigarette, that's when I asked him, "Who was the other guy?" He said, "Someone stole my backpack from me while I was sleeping." Oh, okay. He was definitely homeless then. I felt so bad. I started pulling out my wallet. I wanted to give him all the money in my wallet out of guilt. He looked fine now, albeit the bloody scraped arms, as his breathing had gotten normal. While pulling out my wallet and asking, "You sure you don't want me to call an ambulance?" That's when I felt the sharpest pain rock my face. I saw blurry for a couple of seconds. I started stumbling, and my body felt like it was about to fall over. Dizzy. When I came to, I saw my car pulling away and driving off. He punched me and took off, and left me with a pretty bad headache. I stood there in shock for what seemed like an eternity. I reached for my phone out of instinct, then I remembered I left it charging. Shit. I reached under my jacket to check if my gun was still on me. I felt relieved as I felt the cold metal of my Sig Sauer. Okay, good. At least I'm not out here defenseless. I kept walking down the road, endlessly, hoping to find someone. I was pissed off and scared, and a good few miles later I see some lights. As I get closer, I see it's one of those public restrooms. Well, nothing else in sight. There might be a payphone though. Now what do I see next? I couldn't believe my eyes. There's a car that looks just like mine parked right out front. I take a peek. The guy that took my car is asleep. Looks like he cleaned his arm off. No jacket. That moron. He could have kept driving, but I'm glad he didn't. I take out my gun and try to open the door. It's locked. I try all the doors. Locked. I didn't want to wake him up by banging on the car because I was afraid he was going to drive off. I looked over all the ground, and there was nothing to break the window. So I holster my gun, take off my jacket, and wrap it around my hand. I smash through it, glass spilling everywhere, and the guy jerks awake and starts fumbling around. All the while, I drop the jacket and rapidly unholster my gun. I'm pointing my gun right at his head and he says, "Please don't shoot me." Instead of saying sorry, he just says that shit. I tell him to get out and walk towards the wall with his back turned. So I back up as he complied. I tell him not to move and then ask him where my keys are. After I got my keys from him, I drove off with glass all over the inside of my car. I never called the cops because I had hit him earlier and then because I pulled a gun on him. I was scared and worried about the legality of it. Also, I had brought it from an arms list, but the seller never signed the bill of sale. Only I did. So I was sketched out about that as well. Last thing I need is them checking my gun after he tells them about it, and finding out the guy who sold it to me reported it as stolen. I probably would have been fine calling them, but I was tripping and never met the Craigslist chick. I went home. 2 weeks ago, I went camping in the Zagros Mountains as part of a last-minute post-college unwinding session. I was getting ready to start working at a local law firm, but I wanted to see a little more of the world before too much time passed. On an impulse, I bought myself a ticket, and 3 days later, I was flying out of the Boston International Airport. 29 hours later, I was standing at one of the trailheads, which started in the southwestern corner of the Iranian Plateau and ran for 14 miles until it merged with another trail. While I don't have any idea about the local geography, I did have some pretty good navigational items on me, and the path was so straightforward that I wasn't worried about getting lost. My plan was to take 2 days to hike this trail, and then I'd head into one of the big cities and see some of the nightlife. I'd maybe find myself a girl or two to show me around, and then I'd head back home for the end of the week. It was a foolproof plan, and I couldn't wait for my first night in the woods. Everything went perfectly that day. I covered the first 7 miles, and then I set up camp in a small grove of oak trees. I hadn't seen another person out there, and the trail looked less used than I'd expected, but I loved how much wildlife I had seen. I made a fire and heated up one of my dad's MRE dinners, and to my surprise, the military packaged beef stew didn't taste bad at all. Before heading to bed, I made sure that everything was stored away carefully, so that animals wouldn't try to get into anything, and I fell asleep within minutes of crawling into my tent. Sometime later I woke up, and it took me a moment to remember where I was. I lay still trying to figure out what had pulled me out of my slumber, and after a few minutes, I didn't hear anything, so I wrote it off as a dream and fell back into a light sleep. The next time I woke, I could see the moon shining through the tent window, and I could hear soft, lovely music. My first thought was that it sounded like the kind of flute you hear in Celtic songs, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded ethereal and out of sync. It was as though multiple instruments were playing, and the rest of the nocturnal forest sounds had ceased. I untangled myself from my sleeping bag, and I carefully unzipped my tent so that it didn't make any abrupt noise. I didn't think I was in any particular danger, but I wanted to be cautious, since it was admittedly weird to hear random music in the middle of nowhere at roughly 3 a.m. I left my eyes to adjust to the moonlight. With it being a full moon, I could see my campsite well enough. Everything was in place, and I didn't see anyone around. The music sounded like it was coming from off to one of the sides of the clearing. and it didn't sound particularly close. I propped my head back into my tent, long enough to grab my boots and a flashlight. Then I closed the tent behind me and began to follow the music. I was intensely curious, and I figured that if I maintained a good distance from the sound, no one would ever know I were there. I crept along the edge of the clearing, trying to keep to the shadows while making my footfalls light. I followed the haunting music into the darkness, my senses on overdrive as I tried to track it. I wasn't the best woodsman, but I liked to think that I could handle this. After about 10 minutes, I came to a halt, my chest squeezing in a moment of blinding panic. Whomever was playing the music was probably perfectly friendly, but in the off chance that they realized I was defenseless, surely I could always punch them. But that wasn't going to do me much good if they had a weapon, or they could take a hit. I began checking the ground near me, and I soon found a sturdy, thick branch that seemed like it could do some damage if necessary. I tucked it under my arms, cradling it to me as I advanced. It took me another 5 minutes, but I soon found the source of the music. As I got closer, I shut my flashlight off, and I waited to see who was there. It took my brain a moment to process what I was seeing. I had expected a person to be sitting at a campsite playing music, but all I saw was a deer. The clearing it was in was flooded with moonlight, and the flashlight was bright enough that I wished I had a camera with me. After a minute, it raised its head from the berry bush it had been grazing on, and that was when I saw that it wasn't a deer. Its single antler was long and spiraled, almost like that of a gazelle, but I could see that each prong had a hole in it. The antler was acting like a pan flute, since it made a musical sound whenever the breeze blew across them. I studied it in fascination, and that was when I realized we weren't alone. Along the edge of the clearing, several animals had poked their heads out and were cautiously surveying their surroundings. They were all drawn towards the deer-like creature, and they seemed to be as interested in the music as I was. Each time the wind blew, the animal crept a little closer, and soon I could see that there was a weird mix of them. There were a couple of striped hyenas, a snake, some Persian fallow deer, some rabbits, and even a cow. I didn't even realize that Iran had whatever the deer thing was, much less hyenas, so that came as a surprise. As I tried to identify the rest of the animals, a violent gust of wind began blowing, and the once silent animals instantly turned agitated. Over the enraged sounds of hisses, growls, bellows, and thumps, I could hear the music soar, but now it had a heavier, more aggressive quality to it. The animals began turning on each other, and soon it was a war. Biting, clawing, kicking, and stomping began to kill them off, until only 2 animals remained. The cow and one of the hyenas stood panting as they faced off against each other. They were covered in bloody gashes, and the cow looked like it was missing an eye. As the violent song died down, the cow shook its head, as if it were trying to get a fly out of its ear, and the hyena let out a scared, confused whimper. Throughout the carnage, the horned thing had stood in the same spot, and I don't think it had moved a muscle. It finally stepped away from the bush, carefully stepping over the carcasses and gore until it stood in front of the remaining animals. They held their grounds, and the hyena began growling. The deer-like creature shook its head, and a piercing whistle-like sound came from its horn. It startled the animals, who both skittered away. I had no idea what I had just witnessed. It had happened so brutally and quickly that it had been hard to keep track of any one animal, and I had to force myself to keep breathing steadily so that I wouldn't vomit. I had never seen bloodshed like that, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. As I began to back away, The creature daintily made its way into the center of the clearing, and to my disgust, it began feeding on the slain animals. I could hear bones snapping wetly, and that was when my stomach betrayed me. I vomited, and when I finally stopped heaving, it was gone. I could smell the blood and viscera in the air, which sent my stomach into another wave of nauseated cramps. I made my way back to my tent, practically crawling at some points, and that night, I barely slept. What little sleep I did was filled with nightmares, and without hesitation, I cut my trip short. When I had internet service again, I spent some time trying to find what the creature was, and it seems like it was a shadva. The easiest way to explain it was by calling it a carnivorous unicorn, and they were thought to have gone extinct hundreds of years ago. The type of animals they like eating respond to the sounds of their horn, and that's when it's too late for the prey to escape. It's a fascinating creature, but I hope to never see one again. Over the span of a week, I've had a number of strange encounters. It started when I was sitting in a vacant lot, with my buddy shooting the shit. We'd heard dogs crying and howling. We made a few jokes out of it, but then we watched a deer walk out, and it just didn't look right. It looked like something trying to look like a deer. Its legs didn't move right, and it looked like it was drunk. The deer eventually takes off, and we start to hear the dogs howling and sounding distressed. I was thoroughly spooked. Being native, I've heard plenty of spooky stories about skinwalkers, and as I started to drive, we both noted a putrid smell. The following night, as we were driving through town, I smelt it again. Rotten meat is the best description I have at the moment. A deer who looks odd, like the one spotted the night before, runs out and stares at my vehicle before darting off into the darkness. As we finish driving down the streets, we hear a man scream and nope the hell out of there. We head back to his house and sit and chill on the deck and theorize about what just happened, and we hear a low whistle. As I was walking back out to my vehicle, I could hear dogs howling again. A large black dog runs out from a house and stares me down before it takes off. I drove home with just the worst feeling of dread and uneasiness. I worked the next night as a security guard and had a small area to patrol, literally 2 trailers of equipment. I had walked around the trailers once and was about to do it once more when I heard an owl very close by. I kept walking and found a large feather in between these trailers. I was just there. It was laying right where I had shined my flashlight and seen nothing. I went home and was laying in bed and heard something walking around smacking the side of my house and heard something trying to open my bedroom window. I'm trying to be as rational as I can, but I'm starting to get freaked out. Could it potentially be a skinwalker? So, my wife and I backpack/hike a lot. The more remote the place, the better. In 2015, my wife and I were in the Bitterroot Wilderness in Montana. We had been out for 2 weeks on a 100-mile route, finding trails we kind of connected together on a few topo maps to make a loop. We had only seen one other person, Tom. We met him on our second day in, and his last day out. He told us that he hadn't seen or ran into anyone out there, so as far as we all knew, we were going to be alone out there. He told us hunting season was weeks away, but there might be scouts out, to be very careful with our food, where we eat, and our scent, because it's bear country. and he had seen a few, and even one with cubs. He also mentioned that he had heard cougars in the distance, but that we should be okay as long as we stick together. We camped together that night, and the next morning we thanked him for his company, all the information he had given us, and parted ways. For 2 weeks, we hiked, saw some cool vistas, swam, saw and heard wildlife, and all the stuff you'd expect to see in the backcountry. We didn't really think about Tom again after a few days out, and hadn't seen anyone. We took the thought of being alone for granted, and let our guard down. As far as other people were concerned, we were all alone out there. We were in our last few days out, winding the trip down, sauntering back to the trailhead, and just taking it all in. We found a nice flat tent site, made a fire, cooked some dinner, and hung our food bag and walked back to our tent for the night, and passed a good night's sleep. The next morning, as backpackers do, we break camp as early as possible, get some breakfast and coffee into us, but before we leave camp, I really needed to drop a deuce. So I venture away from the tent site to find a suitable spot. As I'm walking around, I find a place to dig my cat hole. I come up on a lumped up thing looking like a bush. I was not expecting to run into anyone out there, as we had only seen one other person early on, and no one else since. I wasn't paying attention. I was looking for somewhere to go, and not looking out for people. These two are in camo/blind type of wrap, and I didn't realize they were there. They didn't hear or realized that I walked up on them till the last damn minute, when I was right on top of them, tripping over one of their legs. They scared the crap out of me, and I scared the crap out of them. When I hit the guy's leg, I startled him. He kind of jumped up, knocking their blind off for the big reveal. The guy that was on his knees had a penis in his hand, apparently blowing the other guy that is up against the tree. Is looking at me with a look of, "WTF? Who are you?" and "I'm caught." My sight is going back and forth from hunter, penis, hunter, hunter, penis, and the guy standing yells at me, "What are you doing, man?" They scramble, trying to stand up, the other one pulling his pants up, all while both fighting the blind that's wrapped in between them. Me, in disbelief on what just came up, just stood there for what felt like forever. I stumbled over my words to find an apology and blurt out, "Nothing guys, sorry, have fun," and turned back to my camp and almost ran. They yelled out to me to stop, but I didn't. It was the longest 200-yard sprint ever. I got back to my camp, and my wife looked at me and instantly knew something had happened. She asked what was up. I told her to grab her stuff, and we hurried out of there without a word. After about an hour of sprinting and hiking, we had to stop. I still hadn't taken a dump, and I really had to go. So we took a spur trail to break, snack, and tell her what happened. She told me she was worried and that I had scared her. She was scared the whole time, thinking I'd been chased by a bear or cougar or something, and that it was after us. I told her it was nothing like that it was just two hunters hiding out blowing each other. We talked a bit about it, and she asked if I thought they were looking for us. I told her that they yelled at me, wanting to know what the hell I was doing, if we should just make it back to the car and leave. No, let's just wait them out, just in case they're at the trailhead waiting. Like I said, we'd been out for about 2 weeks now, and we have been making our way back, and are less than a day's hike from the trailhead at this point. So they must have gone out after being caught, right? After a while of talking it over, we kind of just chuckled it off, and hiked on to the creek where we were going to camp for the next night. We made camp off trail in a nice outcrop with no incident. Next morning, we break camp, do our morning routine, and hike out to the trailhead. With that, we're not really thinking of the two hunters anymore. Well, as we get to the trailhead, we meet two ladies that had been prepping breakfast and now cleaning up. As we were walking to the parking lot, they chat up with the usual backcountry questions. How long have we been out there? How many miles did we do? Did we see any bears? What did we eat? Then amongst all the same, one lady offered up some food they had left over. As the other gal starts yelling, "Hey hubby, these two have been hiking up the same trail you and so were just out the other day on. But they were out for 2 weeks. Bring them some of that real food and juice." The hubby pokes his head out of their camper to say hi. Lo and behold, it was the hunter that was against the tree. His smile faded as quick as his face turned white, and then to an angry look when he realized who he was looking at. Then his buddy, the giver, turns the damn corner from the trailer to see me standing there. I feel the blood just drain from my body, and this guy's face turns from happy-go-lucky to disbelief and fear at the sight of me. The wife then asked if we happened on their husbands out there, as they were scouting for game yesterday. As I'm stumbling my words, they are darting to looks from me to themselves. Before I can say anything, my wife is answering, "Yes, we'd love some real food. No, we haven't seen anyone. You guys are the first we've seen in 2 weeks." The wife turns to the hunters and say, "You guys must have had real good hiding spots." I think both the hunters and me had a mini heart attack. One of the guys just gives a nod. My wife and I graciously take their pancakes and sausage. I can see both hunters quietly talking to each other, staring over at me every once in a while. I do my best to avoid the situation by picking up the car, while my wife is thanking the hunters' wives for the food. Both hunters with sidearms on their hips. They come up to me with a beer. The one that was on the tree kind of pushed it into my chest, asking if I'd seen anything out there. My heart freaking stopped. I again stumbled over my words. Other than some wild animals, nothing worth writing home about. Yeah, we didn't see much either, but we're really surprised you didn't hear us last night walk through your camp. Be careful. You never know what can happen out there in the middle of the woods. After a few seconds, the other one just smirks, and they turn to leave. Have a safe trip home. I wasn't sure what was going to happen in that moment, so I was readying myself for a fight. I was kind of shaken up as we were leaving the trailhead, and my wife asks if I was okay, and if they were the guys I'd seen. My reply was, "Yeah, what do you think, babe?" and then asked what they said to me. I told her I thought I was going to have to fight them, but they just aggressively gave me a beer to buy my silence. I didn't mention the passive-aggressive threat that they made about walking through our camp. I guess hunters can really be dicks sometimes. For years I've been reading about skinwalkers, and only recently have I had a personal experience. I live in a suburban neighborhood that often has possums, ferals, and the like. I've never feared them. I was in my backyard one night, being melodramatic and burning some photographs, which had made me incredibly sad and negative. During that time, I felt an intense presence. I felt like I was being watched, and heard occasional leaves being crushed. I got freaked out and went inside. I fell asleep on my couch, and after a few moments from falling asleep, I heard a loud banging on my back door. I woke up my roommate and told him about it, asking to check it out with his gun. When we looked outside, we saw a cat sitting on the steps staring at us that eerily resembled the cat that we'd been feeding for years now. Except it was so wrong. Its markings were incredibly off, its eyes were human-like, and we both felt chills immediately after seeing it. I've read that in order to replicate a being's appearance, the Skinwalker has to kill that being. But after, I did see our usual stray with her usual markings. This was incredibly eerie. This happened to my mother in the 80s. Her parents had died when she was young, and her auntie, who had looked after her while she was growing up, had suddenly died from a tumor. Things weren't going well, as my auntie was heavily in debt, and my mother had to sell pretty much everything that she owned in order to try and pay them off, which she couldn't even do in the end. This left her homeless, and with the little money she had, she bought a tent and ended up camping in the woods on the outskirts of our city. She had a rough start, and this wasn't ideal, but she found a job waitressing at a local strip club nearby. They had showers which she could use, and she was very grateful just to get clean, she told me. There was one time at about 3 a.m. as she was finishing up her shift that she was making her way back. That night, a guy had been trying to talk to her, but all my mother could think of was about getting this money this month so that she could hopefully try and find somewhere to rent, as living in a tent is not only dangerous, but damn right horrible. You can't fit your life into a small plastic sheet, as she put it. Anyway, this guy was following her home. He kept telling her that she was beautiful and that he wanted to take her out, but my mom wasn't interested and told him to please leave and that she was waiting for her husband to pick her up by the forest. She knew that she couldn't make it back to her campsite because this guy would find her, and it's not like she had any protection or security. So she went in a different direction and just kept on walking. The guy, probably slightly drunk, still persisted, and she was getting very agitated. That's when out of nowhere he broke out into a run, and my mum defaulted to run back to her camp. She ran as fast as she could and said that she lost the guy. When she made it into her tent, she turned out her flashlight and just lied there, silently. She didn't even want to get into the sleeping bag because she didn't want to make the noise, and was conscious of every sound around her as it permeated through the tent as she listened in silence. Growing ever more nervous, she waited until she passed out from the fear. She doesn't know what time this happened, but she woke up in the middle of the night. It was still dark, and she could hear footsteps gently rustling near her tent. She was bricking it at this point, confident it was the man from earlier. She tried to squint, but without any light, it would be impossible to see, as this guy didn't have a flashlight either. How the hell could he have found her tent, she thought. Maybe he turned on the flashlight before. She laid there, getting ready to die, or ready to embrace whatever dark plans this sicko had. She didn't even have any protection. No knife, no gun, nothing. Perhaps the blunt end of the flashlight could do some damage, but it was light, cheap plastic, and she severely doubted it. As she waited in silence, the footfalls padded away, and she stayed alert, waiting for them to return. It was when the first signs of daylight started to break through that she got the courage to exit her tent and look around. She didn't find anything amiss, but as she was getting up to go pee, did she see a paper on the ground that wasn't there when she arrived. It was a flyer from where she worked, and scribbled on the back was an ominous message. "Be here tomorrow, and I'll kill you." It didn't take her long to abandon her tent, and she slept round one of her co-workers' houses for the next few nights. That ended up turning out to be 2 years, as they ended up getting along pretty well. And she finally got enough money to get her own place and met my dad. And that's a story for another time. My mum doesn't like to dwell on what happened, but she knows very well she got lucky, as that guy managed to track her down and she was defenseless. He could have done horrific things while she was asleep. Who knows? If he'd have gotten his own way, I don't think I'd have a mum or be here to share her story. When I was a kid, around 6 or 7, my parents would take my brother and I camping all the time. There was one time where we were camped out in the middle of this forest, where you could pay to have your own section on the trail. My dad picks one that is at the end of the trail, so that we don't have people walking past us in the morning to go to the restrooms/showers. Probably the second night we were there, my dad lets us stay up till 12:30, which is a big deal when you're a kid. He's telling us all these scary stories, and we're having the time of our life. Just as we're about to go to bed, we see a figure biking towards us. I figure that it's a park ranger, or someone like that, to see if we're doing all right. Nope. This guy, who is completely hammered, gets off his bike and starts walking towards our site. As he's walking up, I see that he has a rifle on his shoulders. He begins by saying something like, "Why you guys have my spot?" and all this weird shit about how he stays here every night. My dad politely asks him to leave, but I can tell my dad is starting to tense up. This guy starts completely going off on my dad. My dad stands up, and the guy moves for his rifle on his back. As soon as that happens, my dad reaches into the fire and throws a log at the dude. Then my dad tackles him, and told my mum and brother and I to run for the park rangers. We run, and tell the rangers who are already looking for the guy, and they go and help my dad. My dad was taken in for questioning and let off the next morning. His hands were bruised as hell, but he had no burn marks. This morning, I left the house early, 4:45 to be exact. I had an early appointment and needed to drive about 3 hours to get to my destination. I usually take the main roads, but I decided to take the back roads that drive through an Indian reservation. That road would save me about 45 minutes, and I would have plenty of time when I get to my appointment. I have heard the stories about Skinwalkers, and I never thought I'd see one. This morning, I'm sure I did. I was driving about 60 on a reservation road when I came across a herd of horses. I slowed down, thinking that a horse might cross my path and that I might have an accident. I didn't see any other cars on that road. Something caught the corner of my eye. It was something shadowy and moving beside my car. I turned to look at it, and it was just outside my view, and I looked into the mirror. That's when I saw a face. It looked like an old woman. The face was painted white. It looked horrible. It was ghastly, very wicked and ugly looking. I looked away and screamed and slammed on the gas. I was in full panic, with no intention of looking back, and I kept driving as quickly as I could. I was a mess. I wanted to cry and pull over and try to get some composure, but I wouldn't dare stop on that road. I finally made it to the main road, and I felt at ease that there were more cars on the road. My heart was racing, and I was having a panic attack. I'll never take that road again. I have no idea what I saw, but I'm guessing that it was a skinwalker. I used to live in a part of Memphis, Tennessee, that was a little shaky. It was right on the edge of what some would call the ghetto, but also there was a nearby area that was pretty secluded and desolate, as I lived on the outskirts of the city. kind of near the industrial part near Raleigh, for anyone familiar. I was an 8-year-old boy when this happened, and my sister was 5 years my senior. The two of us went for walks on occasion. This time, we went to the back of the housing division, and further than we'd ever gone before. This area was pretty dirty, and desolate for such a city. Just train tracks and a nearby industrial facility. Lots of dry tang grass coming through spots in the railroad gravel. Lots of dusty crap people dumped illegally around the tracks. There used to be a pack of stray dogs that walked around my neighborhood. But other than that, no people or cars would really ever be seen out there. Not that far behind my neighborhood anyway. We were just walking along the tracks, talking, throwing rocks, when I saw some strange movement just beyond the tree line of this small wooded area, about 40 feet ahead, and on the left a bit. I told my sister to look as we walked a bit closer. We had made it about 10 to 15 feet away from the woodland area, when we realized the movement was in fact a mime in the middle of nowhere, seemingly hidden amongst the trees and thick dead vines that adorned the edge of the wooded area. Painted face, black striped shirt with black pants. He had the exaggerated expressions of a mime too. His eyes got really wide as he seemed to start performing for us. He was kind of being way too into it. Maybe he was trying to attract us, perhaps entice us into the wooded area where he stood, or lurked for that matter. I honestly couldn't tell you much about him, as we ran away quickly. I do remember, however, that it was very hot outside that day, and his makeup was pretty dingy and gross, as were his clothes. I know this sounds pretty unbelievable, but I assure you, it happened. I sometimes wonder who the mime was. I'm sure he wasn't there to kidnap children, but who knows what would have happened if we'd have gone into that thicket. And why there? He was just simply insane, I think. His mind gone, which is far more creepy than any stranger I have read about. I spend weeks alone in the woods by myself, and I used to go on group camping trips about 2 weekends a month for 10 years. I was born into camping and love it. Most of my outings are trips to the Ocala National Forest in Florida and other state/national parks. Most odd occurrences are with other people and animals, and I've stumbled into neo-Nazi rallies and clan gatherings several times. Multiple interactions with the odd hunter and their tracking dogs. However, last year finally opened my eyes to the dangers of being alone. I was heading to my usual spot in Ocala, a free primitive campground next to a secondary creek, and noted a Department of Corrections bus. The officer there stopped me and briefly inquired about my reason for being there. I asked what was going on, because I was going to be camping in the area. He said a body was discovered by the road and was linked to a case in the area, and the prisoners were there to search the area. The case was being built for a local man linked to the murder. I left the scene and went home, rather than camping, thinking the entire time about last year, when I was alone in my tent and heard footsteps outside. Assuming it was a bear, I pulled the side of my handgun loud, just enough for it to be heard. But rather than an animal noise, it was the whispered hush of a man's voice, laughing. I think I may have avoided being part of that case. The man was arrested for something and then linked to a ton of the murders in the area, and he is still serving time in prison. When I was 13, my parents and I took a trip to Yellowstone National Park. While hiking a trail, we heard a huge crash and a loud scream. "Watch out!" were the words yelled from someone not in sight on the trail ahead. Hundreds of buffalo appeared crashing through the trees coming towards us. Executing our natural fight or flight response to this dismal turn of events, we ran as fast as we could through the woods. I tripped at one point and remember screaming out to my mother, who was already there to help me out. My father yelled at us to follow him as he started running up the hill on the other side of the path. 5 seconds later, we saw the herd of buffalo passing us. Turns out if you ever are being chased by a herd of buffalo, you should run up a hill, because the herd will naturally go downhill. We went to a diner right after that for lunch, and I ordered a buffalo burger, and it gave me a sense of victory. My old man was an avid outdoorsman in the Colorado Rockies in the late 80s. He'd go on week-long treks with his buddies. One summer, they'd been out for a few days in Pikes National Forest. They set up camp in a ravine they thought was safe. That night, my dad unzipped the tent to take a leak in the dark, and outside stood a pair of pale bare feet. My dad screamed and unzipped the tent. Everyone else woke up and asked what was wrong. My dad said someone was barefoot out there. They went out and flashed their lights for a bit, hollering. My dad swore he saw what he saw and described the feet in detail. They were old, blotchy feet. One even had a lump on the ankle. Tony, his buddy, asked which foot, left or right, and my dad said it was the right. Then Tony said they needed to move their camp immediately. Dad asked why. Tony said they didn't have time. They went along and packed up and moved it to the top of the hill. The next morning they woke up to find a flash flood had torn through the ravine during the night. It would have surely killed them. Tony's grandfather had died a month prior, and one of the last things he said to him was that he would always watch over him. The feet my dad described reminded Tony of his grandfather's very feet. My dad is highly religious, supernatural or not. Someone's vision of paranoia saved their lives that night. This was at about 3:35 in the afternoon, and it was clear as day, obviously. And I live in Harriman, Utah. It's known for skinwalkers, especially Skinwalker Ranch. But I am very sure of what I saw. My mum and I had just got back from picking me up from school, and we also got McDonald's on our way back. My house has these huge windows that face the mountain, because we basically live on it, and there are only a few other things behind us. But I was just enjoying eating my McDonald's and watching the TV, when I saw a large, dark figure running on the mountain. This thing was taller than the trees, which were about 8 feet tall, and was running faster than a human can through trees and sagebrush type weeds. At first I thought nothing of it, because I assumed it must be an elk or something. Then I realized it was running on 2 legs, and the last time I checked, elk or deer don't run on 2 legs. I began freaking out, and to this day still don't know what it was. I ran to get my stepdad's binoculars, but it was already too late. Could it be a skinwalker? I live in the countryside, in an old cottage on its own, surrounded by forest and fields. There's a dirt road about 8 miles long, which takes you to a small town called Bampton in Oxfordshire. It was about 11 p.m, and I went out with my dog to take him on a walk, as I had been at work all day and hadn't done it yet. So anyway, we were going down the dirt road when my dog froze, and no matter how many times I said his name, he ignored me. All of a sudden I turn to see this deer thing looking at me, half dead face, and it had blood and flesh falling off its leg. It had a bone showing, and it stared at me for what felt like 8 minutes before it jumped on its back legs, sort of like how a horse does, then ran away on all fours. I ran back to my house, and when I got there I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of the woods. I was scared, to say the least. What the hell was that? A few years back, a friend and I used to camp out in the woods near my house. You weren't technically supposed to camp there, but it's not like anyone would notice if we did. Anyway, we set up camp, had a few drinks, and eventually went into the tent around 1 to 2 a.m. My friends fell asleep pretty much instantly, but I couldn't get comfortable because there was a rock or something under the tent where I was sleeping. It's a 2-man tent, so there wasn't a whole lot of room to move around or anything. After about half an hour, I saw a faint light from the distance shining into the tent that slowly got closer. I don't know why I didn't wake my friend up right away, and after the light got about 5 meters from the tent, it began circling once or twice, at which point I was trying my best to quieten my breathing and was nudging my friend to try and get him up. After what felt like forever, my friend finally woke up. I pointed to the light source, and we ended up running out of the tent, shouting, and waving the axe that we had used to collect wood for the fire. At which point, the person seemed to leg it, because we never found any trace of him again afterwards. We called up my parents, and got them to drive up to us and take us back home. Bear in mind, we were 17 to 18 at the time. About a week later, my mother found out from one of her dog walking buddies that there was a man in his late 20s that routinely snuck into farms around our area and took pieces of farm equipment, so I could only assume that he was looking around our camp for things to take. Almost 4 to 5 months after that, a homeless man was arrested for murdering his friend in a town close to where I live. Apparently, he used to sleep in and around the woods that we were camping in. The moral of this story is not to go camping where you don't belong. Go find an actual campsite where there are people who will protect you from this sort of thing. It's better to pay $20 for a safe place to camp than risk any confrontation later down the line. My boyfriend and I went backpacking in the mountains. I'd been camping before, but only car camping, and didn't have to carry my bag for long, if at all. So this was my first time actually backpacking. After getting lost, trying to find a parking lot that the map swore was there but wasn't actually there, we drove around the mountain and finally found a parking lot at the top. We'd planned to walk down the mountain, camp, and then walk back up the following day. About an hour in, it's maybe 6 p.m. and we come across this guy sitting off to the side of the trail, cooking in a cheap gas stove. He asks if we know where we're at, and if we can point him in the direction of a certain place on the mountain, and says he was parked there. He continues talking about how he had a friend drop him off, who was going to pick him up at point A, and then changed the story to he was parked at point B, and said the friend who dropped him off went to hike somewhere else, and another friend who had the map turned back to point C to wait in the car. We finally bid this dude good luck and continue down the trail. The trail is poorly marked and doesn't correspond with the map we found online. We couldn't get an actual map because the park office was closed due to asbestos. So we're really confused when we come to a horse trail with no markings to tell us if we're still on the right path. We decided to go down the trail and see if we can find a place to camp for the night and find our way out in the morning. Both sides of the trail are lined with barbed wire, preventing us from being able to camp there. Eventually, we run into a huge puddle in the middle of the trail, and we decide to turn back and go back to part of the trail before it turns into a horse trail. That way, we can camp there for the night, because it was really dark and we were tired. About 20 feet behind us was the man from earlier. He talked to us again, and throughout the conversation we learned he had heavy narcotics, including fentanyl, and another one I don't remember the name of. By this time, there are so many red flags, changing stories, following us, fentanyl. So we took off and decided to go back to the car and just drive home. We live about 4 hours away, and we're about 6 miles from the car. So we take off up the trail as fast as we could. I got severely dehydrated on the way and was struggling. We had plenty of water, but it was very hot, and we're practically running up the mountain. Eventually I started hallucinating, thinking I was vomiting blood, but it was just red Gatorade, or that there was some blood coming from my shoes, sweat. And there may or may not have been a bear somewhere nearby, but that could have been a hallucination too. We ended up doing the full 6 miles up the mountain in 2 hours. We reached the parking lot, and that's when I gave up. I decided to wait on a bench while my boyfriend got the car. The parking lot was curved, so we were out of sight with each other. He finally came back down to me with the car and helped me in. We found a gas station to sleep at for a little while before heading back home. Oh, and as we were driving out of the parking lot, we saw a sign saying hitchhikers may be escaped convicts. Perfect. I remember growing up that I used to spend a few weekends at my grandparents' place. They lived on the reservation, not too far from the Bitsty Wilderness. My grandpa used to have these 3 dogs. He called them his protectors. He used to tell me that they were his alarm system, and they would alert him if anything approached the house. He told me that something would visit them at night, and the dogs would go crazy, bark, and chase something around the house at night. My grandpa had asked me to start digging large holes in the ground so that he could bury the dogs' houses underground. My grandpa said that it would give the dogs an advantage at night. Whatever came at night wouldn't be able to see them until it was too late. Several days went by and it was quiet. Nothing visited the house at night. But one moonless night, it was very dark, and I heard the first dog to the north barking. He started to make a growling sound, and it sounded like he was fighting something. I heard the 2 other dogs come running up to help the other one. I heard a yelp, and by then my grandpa was already up and shot his rifle in the air. Whatever came that night had left, and the dogs settled down. The next morning we found blood and some long hair around the dog's house, and my grandpa found a finger that had a turquoise ring still on the finger. He believed that a dog had ripped off the finger of a skinwalker. After my parents had heard about the commotion, I couldn't stay there much longer, and I had to leave. About a week later, the dogs had died. 2 of them had died from their skin being torn from their bodies, and the other one was decapitated. My grandparents had to enlist the help of a medicine man to keep the skinwalker away. My father owns a large property in rural Australia. About 10 years ago, he had a horse die out in one of the paddocks right next to thick scrubs that surrounds a river running through his property. He dragged the horse with a tractor under a tree and covered it with a heap of branches, intent on burning it later. He forgot about the horse, and it was left there to rot, and it's nothing but a pile of bones now. We remembered this happened 10 years ago, and it's an old, dried-out horse skeleton completely covered by sticks, leaves, and branches. You wouldn't even be able to see it. When 2 weeks ago, Dad went to check out the paddock, and he noticed something strange. Something or someone had taken the horse skull and a lot of the larger leg bones and stacked them up in a pile closer to the scrub, almost about 50 meters away from where it originally was. What could it have been? There haven't been any people out there as far as he knows of. Scavengers like foxes wouldn't be interested in a pile of old bones, and even if they were, they couldn't drag heavy bones and stack them in a neat pile. It's a total mystery. In high school, my buddies and I used to boat at Lake Powell during the summers, and we would camp at Lone Rock and hang out in Page, Arizona at night. One night, a local took us to the trading post on the edge of a reservation down there. On our way, our teenage tour guide was trying to spook us with some crazy native stories, telling us about the old medicine men and the lone rider. We had already heard of some bad omens, like a coyote crossing your path, but none of us were very superstitious. When we arrive, we find ourselves around several abandoned buildings, half falling apart, but still had a few walls standing. It was dark at 2 a.m., but you could see some graffiti and broken bottles on the ground. The structures weren't very tall, but instead were built down into holes in the ground. One building, we're told, was where a child had died after being locked in when her parents left and never returned. We all feel a little eerie, but jokingly try to startle each other or pretend we heard something from inside one of the dark buildings. The local who took us out there was playing along, until she bolted for a car and screamed at us to get in. So we did. We peel out, and once we're back on the road, we are asking what happened. But she says she doesn't want to get into any trouble, and it's bad luck to talk about it. We think she's trying to draw us into some scary story, but she's not happy and not interested in talking about it. Once we're back in town, we're all hyped up and teasing each other about what happened. We head to the Warweep Resort to sneak into the hot tubs, and I go searching for an unlocked maid's closet in one of the buildings to find some towels, and while crossing the parking lot, I see what looked to me like someone's pet husky, but it's bigger, brown, and has a small head. It was just watching me. It's a way away. I figured the owner was close by, so I think nothing of it, and I return with towels. All while we're chilling in the hot tub, 5 feet apart, 2 giant owls land on the perimeter fence behind us. Nothing too crazy. I'm the only one who takes notice, but it seems a little out of sorts, and these birds are big. The next day, we meet a native at the Taco Bell, and we're telling him about our adventure, and he warns us of the Skinwalkers. He tells us they do not like their territory being invaded and mocked. He cautioned us that they track their enemies disguised as coyotes or owls. Anyway, I don't go on late-night reservation trips anymore. I was driving around my friend's old neighborhood, keeping an eye on the place as it's quite a hotspot for the paranormal and supernatural. On one such instance is when he and I were walking down his street. The sun was setting and the evening breeze glided through the trees, all the while as a peaceful, heavy and suffocating surreality filled the atmosphere. Just as a shiver went up my back, he turned to the edge of the woods, and I followed suit soon after. As if on cue, a man's yell, painful and full of agony, broke the eerie serenity of the evening. Now on edge, as this type of thing happens from time to time, we pick up our pace and walk briskly, as his home was just 10 minutes from where we were. But we knew anything could happen between here and there if we weren't careful. About 5 minutes away now, another yell boomed from the woods, but this time, it altered from before, becoming more and more animalistic as it dragged on. We picked up our pace again, the daylight almost completely gone, and finally reached his front porch. And that's when we heard it, behind us. In the woodline, we heard a screech. An awful combination of a rooster's crow, a goat's bleat, and a dog's bark. After that, whatever it was, hissed and began coming towards us quickly. The leaves in the trees rustled as it got closer and closer, jumping down from the branches and into the brush of the bushes and smaller trees. It came crashing towards us and just stopped before it broke out of the tree cover, breathing heavily and pointing its bony clawed fingers out of the brush and to us, curling it in a motion as if to tempt us to come closer. After that, my friend unlocked his door and swung it open, both of us stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind us. As soon as we did, whatever that thing was slammed up against it and tried to break it down. If not at the very least, frightening us. It then sounded as if it jumped from his porch and back into a tree, dashing back into the woods. Later on that night, we heard some occasional scratching, as well as tapping on the windows and other parts of the house, but we didn't bother to open the blinds for obvious reasons. Thankfully, we had the pleasure to not see what it looked like, but did have the misfortune of hearing it screech and seeing its clawed, bony, thin fingers. That's just one of the many uncomfortable, yet equally exciting experiences we've had together. He and I are sensitive to things like this, and as such, from what we've determined, after so many encounters with haunting and breathtaking dauntless beings, are seen as something curious in their eyes, that we may either hinder or help them. Anywho, if you want a good time, be sure to visit Holbrook, South Carolina. It's in Dorchester County, a quaint and quiet little neighborhood. Unfortunately, most of it has been destroyed for housing development, but that doesn't exactly restrain the odd things from occurring. Just be on your guard and stay safe. I'm a native in the Kiowa tribe. Whether this has any bearing on the occurrence that I'm about to describe, I don't know. It's merely for descriptive purposes. In any case, I grew up in a housing addition, where most of the Kiowas in my hometown live, since the addition was built. There were several other kids my age who lived there as well. It consists of 3 streets connected by 2 streets on either side. My grandma lives on one of the corners at the end of the middle street. The street that connects all 3 main streets is bordered by a standard-sized farmer barbed wire fence, with farmers' properties on either side. There's a street lamp on the corner just outside my grandma's house. One night when I was about 15 or so, I was out under that lamp with 2 friends, talking and joking and whatnot. Suddenly, I notice an animal-like figure sitting by the fence in the corner, where the other main street starts. There's a street lamp, and there's a well, but the figure was sitting in a spot that was obscured by shadows caused by a couple of large trees with overhanging branches. It is facing away from the fence. It's very still and makes no sound. It appears to be all black, sits on its hind legs like a canine, and I can clearly see into its eyes, emitting a soft, yellow glow. I point it out to my friend and ask, "What is that?" They turn to look, and we all stare, trying to make sense of it. It looks straight at us for a few seconds that seem like an eternity. Then in one fluid motion, turning while it jumps over the fence, which is a good 5 feet high. It disappears into the darkness, making no sound, though there was only tall grass and fallen leaves and branches on the other side of the fence. Needless to say, we noped right out of there and went to my friend's grandma's house on the street on the far end of where we saw the creature. My family was at powwow, so nobody was at my grandma's house, and there was no way I was staying there alone after that. We told my friend's grandma what we saw, and she told us there are many mysterious things in the dark in the area of Oklahoma, and that we should just be glad that it wasn't malignant. There are many strange things that happen out there. I've grown up with loads more stories from aunts, uncles, and grandparents. I don't think I want to know what it was. I love caving. Absolutely love it. I even joined a caving club. They send you an information pack once a month about featured cave tours. 1 month, they sent out a packet containing a 7-8 hour wild man caving tour. I've been on wild man cave tours before. They're not too difficult. Maybe some rappelling or mid-climbing, but nothing over an hour. This one had a real danger climb. Too much to the right and you get stuck. Slip too far and you can fall in a hole. Getting rescued in a deep cave is basically impossible. There were 5 of us, 3 tour guides, me and another person. About halfway through the cave, they let us rest on this off-shallow ridge thing that was right next to the biggest drop-off in the cave. The guides told us how with the larger groups they did the typical total darkness and had everyone turn off their headlamps and just look around. When he motioned us to follow suit, we did. And after about 30 seconds there was this sound. It honestly sounded like footsteps, and then falling rocks, and finally a screech. Immediately the head guide flipped on his headlamp and looked at us with a panicked glint. I think he thought one of us had fallen or jumped off the cliff. He turned to the other 2 guides and asked if they'd heard it. They did, but couldn't explain it. They hadn't moved, and we were all still there. He radioed to the surface and asked if anyone on the normal tours was missing. This was about 3 hours away from the start of the Wild Man path, and without our headlamps, it was literally like staring into a wall of black. There was no way an experienced or an inexperienced caver would have made it this far. The guides asked us if we wanted to continue with the experience and would understand and refund us if we decided not to. We went along and eventually completed the tour. Everything else went perfectly normal, but I don't know what that could have been. It wasn't animal footsteps, and that screech was blood-chilling. Back in the 80s, I was a camper at this place in the Adirondack, a 6 million acre state park in upstate New York. All camps have their own customs, and I'm not sure if this occurred elsewhere, but I was sitting around a campfire and the smoke was blowing in my face. We would utter the phrase, "I hate white rabbits," and I swear this worked. The smoke would immediately move towards another direction. No, it was not the breathiness of speaking the words that made the smoke move. It was rumored to be a voodoo chant. So things were different back in the 80s. The things we did back then might have gotten you kicked out of camp if you were caught these days. Or maybe it would result in a lawsuit in jail time. Like the time my counselor locked me in his room with a 6-pack of Budweiser tall boys and told me that I couldn't come out until I was finished. But that's a separate story. This camp was right on a very large and pristine lake, and periodically, there would be hikes and canoe trips to some of the islands on the lake. You got to choose your adventure. So we were on this canoe hike to a large, really large, island that was not too far from camp. We were all the slackers, smokers, and stoners on this hike. My kind of peeps. The island was so large. It had a pretty wide running trail that went around the perimeter of the island, wide enough to comfortably ride around a four-wheeler, and they were wider than I was at the time. So I mentioned this was the 80s, right? That first night some of us campers were partying with the counsellor. Beers were being drunk, and someone had some mushrooms that I did not partake in. We, of course, were sitting around the fire. When the smoke blew in someone's face, they said the phrase, "I hate white rabbits." The smoke moved. The next recipient of the smoke said the words, and the smoke moved again. The words began to be uttered more quickly as the smoke moved faster and faster from person to person. At the height of this frenzied chanting, the smoke was starting to almost look like a vortex. The next morning, I opened our tent to see lying on the ground, spanning the width of the running trail, the biggest rabbit I've ever seen in my life to date. It was dead. It had eyes that were glazed over and blue, and it was white. Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we have a very special video, extra long, featuring the amazing talents of Raven Reads. When you're done here, please be sure to go over to check out her channel. The video in question which we'd like you to watch is all about sleep paralysis, and I'm sure that you will all very much enjoy it. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My brother and I were camping outside of Wasp at the foothills of the Appalachians. Me, him, and 2 dogs were sitting around a fire at 2 a.m. A rock the size of a basketball came hurling off the top of the rock face that was around 50 feet up in an arch that landed just short of our fire. We thought maybe it had just rolled from higher up and got some speed. But then we heard growling. Not like a mountain lion or a bear, much deeper. Our dogs, who were very quiet hunting dogs, began growling with their legs between their tails. We noped right into the tent and got our rifles, because something that can hurl a rock obviously cares about bullets. Another time, my uncle and I were hunting in South Alabama, in a giant old pine tree orchard. We stumbled around 15 deer carcasses up in the top of the trees. We just summed it up to poachers and went on our way. Once we were in the deer stand, we heard screaming like a woman, but it was so guttural it made my skin crawl. And was for the first time in my life, I saw fear in that man's eyes. He looked at me in the face and said, "Screw this," and started packing up our gear. Later on, one of his good friends, a full Native American, explained that it was the sound of a Wendigo. I don't know if he was screwing with us or not, but I've never heard a sound like that before, and it took me a couple of years to go back into the woods before or after daylight again. It was the end of my freshman year of college, so my friend and I spent a weekend at my family's cabin by ourselves to celebrate. The weekend was fairly uneventful. The most exciting things that happened involved burning a pizza on the grill and a chipmunk trying to join me while I was using the outhouse. But then, we had to leave. Even though I had gone to the cabin every summer since I was born, I didn't really know how to get to and from it. We had been using my friend's dad's GPS. It was pretty old, and probably hadn't been updated in a while, which is likely why it took us where it did. The route we took was unfamiliar to me, but what did I know? It was a GPS. I trusted it enough to bring us where we needed to go. It took us down a twisted side road that I knew was wrong, but I kept on going, thinking that maybe it was going through the woods and that it would be faster. That's when it told me to take a left. I obeyed, but was extremely confused because it looked like a dirt road. I slowed down and looked at the GPS when my friend let out a horrified, "Oh my God." I looked up and realized we weren't on the road at all. We were in someone's driveway. Then I saw the dolls. They were worn by the weather, full of dirt, and faded from the sun. The ones I took note of were the clowns and bodiless heads. There were so many, I wasn't able to take all of them in, and every single doll was hanging from a tree. My friend and I were both shrieking at this point, her yelling at me to get back up and get out of there, and me yelling, "What the hell," over and over. We safely got back to the main road, and followed that until the GPS gave us a different route, which took us home without further incident. Although I didn't see the person living in that rundown house, it was one of the most terrifying things that has happened to me. It didn't even feel real while it was happening. I felt like I had been dropped in the middle of a horror movie about a serial killer with a doll fetish. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the person living there had been there when we pulled up into their house, but I try not to let my imagination get the best of me. I do sincerely hope we never meet that person. This story took place in my parents' house. It's in the middle of nowhere, 2-kilometer radius of no other houses in the Black Forest. My mom and dad went out for a little partying with my uncle. Me, about 8, and my sister, about 6, had to stay home. No big deal. We were home alone often, as my parents went out a lot. 8-year-old me served some snacks, and me and my sis watched TV in my parents' bed, which was on the upper floor. We loved to watch TV together, like all kids. After an hour or two, we fell asleep, and the TV went off automatically. Fast forward to the middle of the night, and someone is yelling help from outside my window, which happened to be open. I woke up immediately, scared as hell, and I was completely awake at this point, but unsure if this was actually happening. About 20 seconds later, my sister asked me if I'd heard that, and my heart sank into my back. It was real. I told her yes, and that it sounded like Mum. She confirmed, both scared as hell and laying in my parents' bed, too scared to move, when another help came through. Fast as lightning, I ran to the window, leaving the safety of my bed. I shout out for my mum, but nobody responds, and my sister's asking me if my mum is outside and what she was doing there. And then again, someone screams for help. I shout as loudly as I could and ask if my mum is out there, but no one replies. I run back to my parents' bed, creeped out, scared, and my sister and I are crying a lot. The screams keep coming, and I told my sister to stay in bed as I begin running downstairs to grab the phone and to call my mum or dad. I collect myself, ran downstairs, flying to pick up the phone and get back to bed. My heart is beating out of my chest. I call my mum, for no answer, and my dad doesn't pick up either. No one answers the phone. I hadn't heard from them since they'd stepped out the door. The screams persist. My sister and I never had the closest of relationships, but at this moment we were stuck together, and we were protecting each other and the house. We fell asleep in each other's arms, crying. Fast forward to the next morning of 8 a.m. We woke up and nobody was in the bed. Still scared, we walked down the stairs looking for our parents, but they weren't home. I told my sister to lay on the couch while I looked out the window, and I went to the kitchen window to look out, to see if there was a trail of blood or something, but nothing. I ran to my sister, and we waited on the couch to get a sign of my parents, and we didn't say anything. At 9 a.m, they opened the door, completely exhausted, telling us there'd been a car accident in the night around the same time we heard the help screams. They couldn't answer their phones because the batteries had drained. My sister started to tell them what happened, and I already knew they wouldn't believe us. I swear that it really happened, and that it's 100% true, but to this day they still think we made it up. I hope the person screaming for help was okay. I went to Moonville when I was in college in Nelsonville. We decided at around 10 p.m. to go and search for this tunnel, and arrived at about 10:45. Unaware of the parking lot and bridge that led right to it, we parked a few miles down the road, on an old railroad track and path. Our friend promised he knew the way from there, and we followed the walking path that just stops at a very steep embankment in almost 90 degrees. We all climb down and then come to Raccoon Creek and cross a shallow part. We wandered around for a bit, roughly till midnight, trying to find the tunnel and anything particularly paranormal or out of the ordinary, when all of a sudden we're in a canyon type deal, and everything in the middle of it is dead. Trees, birds, insects, nothing was living. Animal corpses covered the canyon thing. One end was a cliff about 35 feet down, and I'm not sure what was there. When we found our way out of the canyon, it was like we just exited a different world. Everything was living again, and you could hear the birds. Thinking to ourselves, we thought we had only spent 30 minutes in there, so we checked our phones, which were our flashlights, and almost dead. It was 3 a.m. Knowing this was the witching hour, we all started to freak out a bit, knowing there were cults and sacrificial rituals being performed out in the woods. Not knowing where we were, as we were trying to use the maps on our phones. There was no service though, so it wasn't much help. But they started to die one by one, until we get to the last bit of battery on the last phone, and we find the one-lane gravel road and get to our vehicles, and get the hell out of there. Since then, I have only been back once, and it was in the daytime after finding out about the bridge. Definitely one of the more creepy experiences I've had down there, and I haven't been back to that spot since. I am very close with my boyfriend's 7-year-old son, and last Saturday, I took him out to one of our local parks to go sledding. There is a dedicated sled hill, and there are tons of families that use it in the winter, which is actually a wide dam that goes across the park by the lake. I should explain there is also a bike/walking path around the entire perimeter of the park that actually goes around the top of the dam and leads to either a main road sidewalk or curves back down to continue the path at the bottom of the other side of the hill. We got there just between 3 p.m. and had a blast all afternoon, sledding and venturing out on the frozen lake. It was a fairly busy day at the park, but around 5:30 it starts to get dark, so the temperature was dropping and people started to go home for dinner. None of these things fazed my little man, because less people meant free reign of the hill to claim better sledding territory. While we were playing, I noticed a man walking along the path at the top of the hill, but didn't think much of it because there was still one group sledding. I did watch him though, because I thought it was a little odd to be taking a walk in the dark alone, with no dog or anything, when it's pretty cold, and I also felt he probably wasn't a park employee doing a safety round, because it wasn't late enough for them to be out, and they usually are in warm vehicles. So a little weird, but he just walked the path with his head down, and when I saw him pass totally, I let us continue sledding. When I got us to the top of the hill, I looked to the bottom of the other side and saw him walking along the path there. I brushed the weird vibe off to me just being paranoid about serial killers and people who take people and the like. I genuinely did not even notice the other group leave because of how engrossed we were in our little racing competitions. I also didn't have my phone out, much because I didn't want the cold to drain the battery faster, but going to where I was from when I made the call to my boyfriend. I think I saw the guy again around 6:30. I was at the bottom yelling taunts up to the kid that he couldn't surpass the distance I had gone when I saw the man walking again, right in my boyfriend's son direction. The height, coat color, and demeanor of this guy were all the same, but other than that, I couldn't be 100% sure it was the same person. I looked down and realized how dark it was, how far away my car in the parking lot was, and how very much alone we were. The only other people near to us were maybe 3 people still out in their ice fishing huts about a half-mile away on the lake. I yelled, "Hurry up," as playfully as I could. The kid sledded down and the guy was passing by the same way he did before. At that point, I was very uneasy and told my little buddy it was probably time to go. He insisted I go up one more time to see if I could beat his distance. This kid had been waiting forever for this sledding day and was having so much fun. So I quickly got up the hill and got ready to sled down. The guy was to my left now, a good distance away, and looked like he was just going to walk the same path. I started to sled down while keeping my head turned towards him. He was almost at the main sidewalk when all of a sudden, I watched him turn his head diagonally down the hill towards us, fast. He was making a beeline for right where we were. I was scared shitless. I hit the bottom of the hill, stood up, and ran over towards the direction of the parking lot in front of us. My boyfriend's son was half focused on the fact that I didn't let him sled down or ride the full distance, and half focused on finding his water bottle before we left, which was somewhere on the ground in the snow. I didn't want to scare him, but I said, "Leave it, we need to leave, just leave it." The guy was approaching, heading down, and one hand in his coat pocket as we were flat out retreating. It didn't feel dangerous enough to break out into a run, plus my car was at the back of the lot, and the ground was quite slick, or to call 911, but I got scared enough that I felt a rush of adrenaline and shoved the kid, still complaining about the bottle, behind me, pulled out my phone and called my boyfriend, who I prayed had gotten off work, because I didn't even comprehend the time until later, about 6:45. He answered and I loudly said, "Hey bud, Dad's on the phone. Yeah, we're leaving the park. What would you like me to pick up for dinner?" I was very afraid this guy was going to pull out a gun or a knife and try to make us go somewhere else, and I knew a phone call probably wouldn't intimidate someone who really wants to hurt you. But it was what my hyped up, scared self decided to do. I went on to ask my boyfriend what time he got off work, even though I knew full well exactly when he got off, and other questions that may tip him off that something was going on. He just answered them as if I were an idiot, and as he talked to me, the guy passed us very closely. He was tall and had a hood on, but I could see his face and glasses. There was so much free open space around us, and he walked so close to me that his coat nearly brushed me, and the fog from my breath touched him. He kept his hands in his pocket the whole time. I am 24 years old and 5'1", and didn't even have my pepper spray on me because my purse was in my car. Thankfully, he just kept going, did not look back, and disappeared behind a truck in the parking lot. Very quietly, I whispered to my boyfriend, who was getting annoyed with the random lines of conversation, "Will you just stay on the phone with me?" He paused for a minute and asked, "Are you scared? What's going on?" I quickly explained it and pulled my protesting kid along to my car, where I shoved him in, shoved the sleds in, and got the hell out of there. I think there's something in your brain that makes you want to believe a bad situation isn't happening. I kept trying to minimize everything as it was happening, probably to keep myself from panicking. Now, I just keep thinking about how creepy it was, that he came back after everyone had left, and seemingly made a decision to turn back around and rush down the hill towards a woman and a child who were all alone in a dark park. Even if he didn't have bad intentions at all, I'm sure he could tell I was scared by the way I reacted to everything he did. He was either a creep or really lacked awareness in what he was doing. From now on, we go home when we see the last few people go home, and it starts to get dark. When I was a kid, my family took a giant camper pop-up tent thing around Europe. We were stationed in Germany in the late 70s. At the time, it was our summer vacation, and we spent it in the wagon, hauling the camper and camping through different countries. There were always interesting things happening at campgrounds. One time, we were almost flooded out by a flash flood/rainstorm along the Loire Valley. Another time, all of our shoes were filled with slugs. But the scary one was somewhere back in France. We were camping at some campgrounds that were on some really old property. Right in the middle of the campground, there was this really old abandoned chateau. It wasn't really that big. You could see in the windows. All the wallpaper was peeling off the walls. Some rooms that you could see into had ragged curtains and a few pieces of furniture. The doors were locked up with chains and had a no trespassing sign in the front in French. My brother and sister and I were playing around the old place at dusk, peeking in the windows until we were called back to the tent for the night. There were probably about 10 other campsites with people in that night. Later, at around 1 a.m., I had to pee really bad. I was old enough to be allowed to take my flashlight and walk to the bathroom by myself, so I quietly unzipped my tent and headed out with my flashlight. I had to go right by that creepy house. I skirted by the house as fast as possible. On my way back, I passed by the house and someone else was walking diagonally from me, and their flashlight reflected on the windows. I glanced over at the light, and there was a giant figure in the window, just behind the curtains that the light illuminated. It was thick and dark, and had white eyes that blinked at me for a second. The person's flashlight moved over pretty fast, and within seconds, the figure was gone. I never ran back to the tent so fast in my life. My mum said she heard me coming when she heard my flip-flops flapping like crazy back to the tent. I would only talk about it in the morning, when it was light again. Let me preface this by saying, I am one of the most skeptical people you'll ever meet. I'm not religious, I don't believe in ghosts or aliens, although I do believe that there might be life out there in the vastness of space, or any of that. This is the weirdest thing I've ever encountered, and have no real logical explanation for. No drugs, no booze, or anything like that were involved. My friends and I went camping up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire most summers in the middle of high school. and a few years after until life happened and we went our separate ways. Now, being a bunch of unorganized teen boys/man children, we always took forever to get in gear and actually get going, usually not leaving southern Massachusetts where we lived until late afternoon/early evening. One year we got up there at about 10 p.m. or so and decided rather than hike into the woods, we would just sort of camp/crash out in the parking lot and hike in the morning. After a bit of unwinding and some food, everyone went to bed, except for me and one other dude. We ended up wandering over a small wooden footbridge over a river, and it was a perfectly clear night filled with stars and a fairly bright moon. And as we were shooting the breeze for a couple of hours about all sorts of stuff, movies, games, life and the like, it had to be well past midnight by this point. So as we were chatting, we both got this creepy feeling of something being there, and it was sinister. Looking at the far end of the bridge, there was this massive dead tree. No leaves, just clawing branches, silhouetted against the sky. We both were like, man, I swear that tree is creeping us out. But that's just silly, right? At first, we tried to dismiss it as silly, but both of us kept feeling more and more unnerved, until finally I was like, screw this, I'm a grown man. I'm not afraid of a damn tree. I'ma walk over there. I get to about 2/3 of the way, and it feels like something reached in and grabbed my pounding heart, and I went ice cold. I backed up and was like, yeah, I'm afraid of a tree. I seriously think I'm not coming back if I go over there. We retreated from the bridge and decided to go back to bed into the sleeping bags by the car. Next morning after breakfast, we decided to hike into the trail by going across that bridge. Halfway across, my friend freezes. Dude? I look across the bridge. It's a clearing. There are no trees there.